the law and improved the law to make sure that, and worked with Mexico to have the Remain in Mexico policy. Biden has abandoned federal policy. In fact, he's deliberately trying to let in as many immigrants as possible. More for the Democrats, more is better and less is racist.
Just astonishing. And the statement that Greg Abbott put out is really feisty stuff. He said the federal government has broken the contract between the United States and the state of Texas. And the eye numbers, Greg, are simply eye-watering. 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border in just 3 years, Governor Abbott says. That's more than the population of 33 states in the United States. Astonishing numbers.
And Martin, that's just Texas. If you add Arizona and other border states, you know, it's pushing 10 million. By the end of Biden's term, it'll be 11 million. A study by Yale University a few weeks ago, 3 very liberal professors that did the study estimate there's 22 million illegal aliens. So this is a crisis that was created by Biden. It's what he wants. They want unfettered access to the border. They're letting them in. It's a real hardship on the working people of Texas and other border states. And now it's a real hardship on cities that the federal government, as well as the governors of Texas and other states, are sending some of the migrants to those so-called sanctuary cities.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, lovely people. I am Neil Oliver and I'm live on GB News TV and radio. Tonight I'll be joined by the German MEP Christine Anderson to talk about the news that the European Union has backed down on net zero targets for agriculture following widespread protests from farmers. And continuing in that theme, I'll be joined by the editor of the Daily Sceptic, Will Jones, to discuss exactly why Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, has taken these steps or announced this movement. And finally, I'll be joined by former White House official Steph Grisham to discuss the interview everyone is talking about when Tucker met Vladimir. All of that and lots of chat with my lovely panellist for this evening, journalist and presenter Ingrid Tarrant. But first of all, let's get a catch-up on the news headlines with Sam Francis.
Neil, thank you very much. Good evening from the GB newsrooms. Just gone 6 o'clock. As we've been reporting today, GB News can reveal around 15 migrants were rescued earlier today after crossing the Channel in a stolen French fishing boat. The small vessel left the French coast between Calais and Dunkirk earlier this morning. The boat was handed over to UK Border Force officials and the migrants were then brought to Dover. That means that so far this year, almost 1,400 migrants have made the journey across the English Channel in small boats. Police are continuing their search here in London in the River Thames for the body of the chemical attack suspect Abdul Azidi. Earlier, a police boat was seen circling between Vauxhall and Chelsea bridges, with the Met Police saying they began their search just after low tide at around 9 o'clock this morning. The 35-year-old was last seen on CCTV on Chelsea Bridge. For those watching on TV, you can see Azidi there, the figure on the left-hand side of your screen, crossing that bridge. And this latest footage was just before 11:30 p.m. on the night of that suspected attack. Detectives now believe Azidi has died, and they say his body may never be found. A woman has been charged today with attempted murder after a suspected poisoning of 2 children aged 9 and 13. Emergency services responded to the scene in East Sussex on Thursday evening after receiving calls of welfare concerns. All 3 were taken to hospital for treatment in the area. Appearing in court earlier, the 38-year-old woman was remanded in custody, and we understand she'll appear again in court on the 8th of March. Authorities say they believe it was an isolated incident and there is no further risk to the public. In Birmingham, pro-Palestinian protesters have been removed from a Barclays bank on the high street there after staging a sit-in. 7 people were seen lying down inside the bank, you can see on the screen there, holding placards and flags saying "Stop the Genocide." It's been reported that one man, angered by the protest, was seen banging on the doors of the bank and tipped over the protesters' table outside the entrance. We understand, though, that no arrests were made. Meanwhile, 3 people have been killed after a car was hit by a suspected airstrike in Gaza's southern city of Rafah. The Palestinians are claiming it was carried out by the Israeli military. You can see here the aftermath of that attack, which happened earlier today. Medics say that a separate strike by Israel overnight also killed 17 other people in the same area. Well, the strike comes after Israel's Prime Minister announced a plan to evacuate civilians from the crowded southern Gazan city of Rafah, and he says to defeat the last Hamas fighters there. The US has said in response it won't be supporting any military action without the guarantee of protection for civilians. Back here in the UK, large parts of the country could face travel disruption and some possible flooding as heavy rain hits later today. The Met Office has issued a yellow weather warning for rain covering Newcastle and surrounding areas all the way down to East Anglia and along the east coast of England. It comes into force in less than an hour's time and lasts until 12 p.m. tomorrow. There's also another weather warning covering much of Cornwall as well as parts of Devon and Somerset that has just started. The latest round of doctor strikes that are planned later this month could be called off if NHS bosses give more time for negotiations. That's according to the British Medical Association. The latest wave of walkouts were announced this week after the BMA said the government had failed to put an improved pay offer on the table. They're asking for a 35% pay rise, which has been rejected by the government. Under the current plans, thousands of medics are expected to strike in England for 5 days from the 24th to the 28th of February. A Royal Navy aircraft carrier, the HMS Prince of Wales, is setting sail this weekend. The £3 billion vessel will take over leading the largest NATO exercise since the Cold War. The announcement comes a week after its sister ship, HMS Queen Elizabeth, was forced to cancel its deployment because of an issue with its propeller shaft. It comes just 18 months after HMS Prince of Wales itself suffered a similar malfunction. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen if you're watching on television, or if you're listening on radio, go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Truth is the kryptonite of the parasite class. There is nothing they fear like the crystal clear sound of someone, somewhere, telling the truth. So dangerous is the truth to those grown rich and fat on the profits of war and corruption, those who have profited most from all the lies and lying. The act of speaking the truth has been criminalised right before our eyes. Julian Assange, the Australian-born journalist and founder of WikiLeaks, a non-profit independent media outlet, has been held without trial in Belmarsh Prison in London since 2019 for telling the truth. He published confidential details about, among much else, the identities of detainees in the dungeons of Guantanamo Bay, filled to overflowing after the invasion of Afghanistan, about the Iraq War, about the relationship between the United States government and President Assad of Syria. Millions upon millions of documents, deeply embarrassing and incriminating to those implicated in their contents. The US government wants to take Julian Assange to the US and put him on trial, or at least to bury him forever, out of sight and out of mind in their legal system. In olden days, castles and jails had oubliettes, bottle-shaped dungeons accessed only via a trapdoor above. Oubliette is French and means a place of forgetting. Since it's impossible to destroy the truth and those who tell it, or at least the memory of their truth-telling, they and it must be put out of sight whenever necessary. So far, the compelled forgetting of Julian Assange has not worked, not quite. The material published by Assange and WikiLeaks was nothing more or less than information the powerful wanted kept in the dark. Assange thrust it impertinently into the light and has paid the price. The allergic reaction of the powerful to the truth is as obvious as the symptoms of anaphylactic shock. In years gone by, the truth could be kept under lock and key, sealed in vaults, or more recently on encrypted hard drives. Along with everything else that money can buy, global media was available to the highest bidder, or perhaps the most manipulative buyer. And so rather than the unalloyed truth that has been propaganda, state-sanctioned propaganda that has dominated the pages and channels pushed into the faces of populations, the advent of the internet, and more recently the journalists of the independent media that the internet inadvertently made possible, has meant the truth, to quote the X-Files TV series, is out there. The truth is the truth, even from the lips of people you might not like. On Thursday, the world was invited to watch an interview by US journalist Tucker Carlson with Russian President Vladimir Putin. It was lengthy, over 2 hours. Anyone watching the content is free to draw their own conclusions about what Putin said and how he said it. Some of it was only his opinion, which is, after all, what Tucker Carlson was after, at least in part. But there were also simple facts about the background to the ongoing war in Ukraine. He cited, for example, the US fomented coup in 2014 when that nation pushed the removal of Moscow-friendly Ukraine President Viktor Yanukovych and his replacement with Washington-friendly Petro Poroshenko. We've had the opportunity to listen to the recording of a telephone conversation between Victoria Nuland, then US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and the US Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, discussing who she would prefer to see as Prime Minister of Ukraine. Without that leaked phone call, without independent journalists reminding the world of the history of Ukraine before February 2022, when Putin sent troops into that country, the wider public might have been induced to forget the past, induced to forget that in the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union, the US and NATO made promises not to expand NATO so much as an inch closer to the Russian border, promises that were soon forgotten. Induced to forget the Minsk Accords, agreed and signed by the interested parties, settling the terms for the end of the civil war in Ukraine that followed events in 2014. Anyone citing that past, that history, was dismissed as a Putin apologist. And yet that history is the truth, however inconvenient it might be to the US, to NATO, to the West. The deletion of the past in relation to events in Ukraine is made even more incongruous and ironical when the war between Israel and Gaza sees the invocation of history that goes back not years or decades, but all the way back to the Old Testament of the Bible. On Thursday, Tucker Carlson's interview with the Russian president did no more and no less than give his audience the opportunity to watch and listen to a world leader stating his case, giving his opinion of events. Listen to him or don't. Believe a word of what he says or don't. Tucker Carlson at least let us look into Putin's eyes, allowed us to consider his body language, to seek to weigh him up, rather than merely demonising him as an irrational madman. But the people of the West are being coerced into forgetting that opposing sides sitting down to listen to one another, to weigh one another's words and gestures, is the essence of the diplomacy the West used to pride itself upon. Instead of diplomacy, what we get now is little more than petty name-calling. I watched Hillary Clinton speaking on MSNBC, a mainstream channel in the US, in advance of the broadcast of the Carlson-Putin interview. Before we had had the chance to hear so much of a word of what had been said, Clinton felt justified in airily dismissing Carlson as a puppy dog and a useful idiot for Russian propaganda. Quote, "There are people in this country right now who are like a fifth column for Vladimir Putin. There is a yearning for leaders who can kill and imprison their opponents, destroy the press." This is Hillary Clinton of the Democrat Party that has been moving heaven and earth and leaving no stone unturned in its efforts to imprison Donald Trump, arguably the most popular politician in America and certainly the Democrats' strongest political opponent. This is the Hillary Clinton who plainly seeks to destroy the credibility of journalist Tucker Carlson, the most popular and arguably the most influential journalist in the US, by describing him as nothing more than a useful idiot. Elsewhere, and even before the interview was broadcast, there were moves to have Carlson identified as a traitor to his homeland. There was talk too of the EU imposing sanctions on him, of denying him the right to travel through EU territory. That Hillary Clinton is, in that same context, still prepared to broadcast to the world about the inherent wrongness in the hearts of leaders who would imprison their opponents and seek to muzzle the free press is indicative either of a complete lack of self-awareness or of insincerity at best and downright dishonesty at worst. In advance of the broadcast, the parasite class was evidently in full panic mode for fear of what Carlson might ask, what Putin might say. It was impossible to listen to Clinton without thinking about all the things she might fear Carlson would tee Putin up to talk about US-sponsored biolabs in Ukraine, about the torrent of Western money flowing through Ukraine and back into the vaults of the military-industrial complex, about the true source of Democrat National Committee emails published by WikiLeaks about disproven Democrat allegations of Trump colluding with Russia in return for power. That Clinton was out there, all guns blazing, about one US journalist seemed to speak volumes, or perhaps left volumes unsaid. The irony is that President Joe Biden was in front of the US media last week as well and gave a performance that once again made plain his cognitive challenges. Articulate and persuasive he was not, and that's only the truth. And that his handlers exposed him to the bright lights of media attention at the same time Vladimir Putin was able to demonstrate, at the very least, fluency of speech and mental acuity seemed nothing less than cruel, or perhaps the inevitable early moves in preparing Democrat supporters for Biden's replacement with someone who can speak in intelligible sentences. That said, the chair of the DNC has been on hand to say any suggestion of Biden's failing competence is only foreign misinformation. The parasite class has been lying for years. We know it. They know we know it. While they felt their goal of total control was within their grasp, they demonstrably didn't care that we knew they were lying about the so-called pandemic, about a climate crisis, about war in Ukraine, war in the Middle East and war elsewhere. But now it seems they would have us believe they do care. Closer to home, the EU puppets have been scuttling around as well, like bed bugs revealed beneath a flipped mattress. Before the US election in November, we can look forward to elections in the EU member states, and the potential removal of their snouts from the trough is focusing EU minds like nothing else ever could. Last week, after months of protests by farmers in the face of all-out war waged upon them by bureaucrats hell-bent on driving them out of existence so they might seize control of their land and of the food upon which the world depends, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen deigned to concede that our farmers deserve to be listened to. Do you think so, Ursula? Ain't that the truth? Or at least for as long as it suits you and the rest of your kind. As well as making transparently election-friendly noises about backing down on drastic cuts to the use of fertiliser that on its own makes possible the feeding of 8 billion people, Eurocrat determination that we proles should eat less meat was also kicked into the long grass, for now at least. They're worried, those desk jockeys and sock puppet politicians in thrall to transnational corporations and entities like the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization, and so they should be. WHO boss Tedros Ghebreyesus has been out again, this time saying the Pandemic Preparedness Treaty is mission critical and claiming most recently that young people have most to gain from what he called a stronger agreement, and urging them to raise their voices to counter lies on social media. This is nothing more or less than yet more propaganda, shamelessly seeking this time to harness the youngest members of our societies for the blatant efforts by a WHO funded most enthusiastically by the biggest private landowner in the US, multi-billionaire salesman of so-called vaccines Bill Gates, to destroy the sovereignty of the populations of the world and give total control to unelected, unaccountable entities focused only on wealth and power. Here's the thing. Having exposed themselves so completely during the COVID era and having unwittingly kept the spotlight on their own anti-human, self-seeking agenda, those chronic liars find they have no alternative, finally, but to seek to control that which they fear most of all, which is the simple truth. They would demonise and then criminalise those who speak the truth with censorship and legislation. That much is plain to see. But, as we have learned to say in recent years, the truth is a lion and needs no protection. We have only to set it free and it will take care of itself. Joining me tonight is journalist and commentator, as well as great friend of the show, Ingrid Tarrant. Good evening, Ingrid.
Good evening.
Pleased to have you with me once again.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be back, honestly.
Did you watch that interview?
I did. I had to stop watching it 3 times in the first 30 minutes, I have to say. It was a little bit laborious, going back through the history, back to 600 and whatever it was. But once it got into it, once sort of Putin and Carlson got sort of a real dialogue going, I found it absolutely fascinating. Neil, I must say, I was born in the 50s, so I grew up consciously afraid of the Reds under the beds. That's what we called them. Communism, the wars, Vietnam was kind of like very much, I was conscious of that. So brought up with the belief and notion that Russia were our enemies, full stop. And when there was the mumblings, and it was several months before the war between Russia and Ukraine started, with sort of like almost being brainwashed into this thing, because I grew up with you know, the Russians are the enemies. I just thought, this isn't right, this doesn't feel right. And completely independent sort of thinking in that sort of respect. When I saw this interview, it just confirmed everything that I believed. I don't read body language, I don't understand it. But there's so much credibility. I know that he tried, and Lavrov as well, to come to some agreement, peace agreement. They didn't want this war.
What about, though, apart from anything else, the strenuous efforts that were made to completely discredit Tucker Carlson and to dismiss as Russian propaganda everything that hadn't yet been said?
I know.
This was before, and then it has ramped up since.
But doesn't that speak volumes, as you rightly said? They're so frightened. They want it's going to blow the whole thing wide open. It's going to make people certainly question what they've heard before, the propaganda that's been fed. And of course they're terrified. So this is in itself they've shot themselves in the foot in a funny way.
To accept for a moment that only one side uses propaganda in a war is a naivety I just can scarcely comprehend.
Of course.
You know, that you would accept unvarnished truth on one hand and nothing but lying propaganda on the other.
Yeah.
We know surely from experience that propaganda is endemic in war.
Of course it does. It's a game. It's kind of war games. It's a game of chess. So of course it's going to happen, and it's up to us to try and find the truth, to filter it.
Absolutely. Into the first break we go, after which I'll be joined by MEP Christine Anderson to talk about the EU dropping its net zero demands after farmers' protests all across Europe. I am Neil Oliver, and this is GB News.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Farage, Monday to Thursday from 7 p.m.
Lots of people have different ideas, but principally a conservative approach to getting growth is to reduce taxes so that people, ordinary people and businesses can spend more of their own money to invest and grow the economy.
So the theory is that you cut taxes and that then pumps more money into the economy.
Exactly right. And then people, you know, it's not government that are creating wealth. It's individuals, businessmen, companies that create wealth. It's the private sector that creates wealth, that the public sector then taxes and spends.
I get the theory, but one of the criticisms of you,
sure,
and I think one of the criticisms actually of all political parties, is they appear to be incapable of cutting government spending.
That's the key. I mean, and I think when I look back, is that we should have had a credible plan to reduce the increase in spending. Now, that's often a difficult concept to explained.
But it's in line with inflation, etc.
That's all right. So when you're slowing the increase, it means, you know, one year you spend £100 and the next year you spend maybe £101 as opposed to going up to £110. So the actual level isn't going down, but you're slowing the increase. And that's very much what I tried to do. And actually, looking back, the one thing I wish I'd done, was to present a credible spending plan at the same time as the tax cuts that we announced.
You had a go, it didn't work out for whatever reason, and that analysis will go on for some years to come. We have Jeremy Hunt there as Chancellor now, hinting quite strongly now there won't be any tax cuts, but the truth of it is, under 14 years of Conservatives, for a variety of reasons, the tax burden has risen.
That's right.
To the highest since the Attlee government, way back in
80 years,
1951,
years,
whatever
right.
it is.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back. My first guest this evening is European Member of Parliament Christine Anderson, who joins me to talk about, amongst other things, the fact that the EU have climbed down on their net zero demands following the farmers' protests around Europe. Christine joins me now, I hope. Good evening,
Hi.
Christine. Very grateful to you for giving of your time this evening. The EU climb down, as it's being touted, how sincere is it, and how much is it pre-election running in fear from the constituency?
Yeah, see, that's just the thing, you know. If we didn't have elections coming up, you know, and she would have done that, I actually might have taken it seriously. But since we are having elections coming up, and the protests, they have been rather persistent. They are in fear. They literally are in fear at this point, because what they don't want is to have more MEPs being elected who actually serve the people and act in their best interest and act on their behalf. So they're trying to cut down on that. And the rationale behind that is pretty much, well, if we give in a little bit, at least, you know, at least we say we will, then they will secure the votes for themselves, and they wouldn't go to parties like my party, for example. So I'm not holding my breath about what she was saying. It's just another smokescreen, pretty much, to fool the people. That's the way I look at it.
Just a technical, can I have a bit more volume, please, in my ear on Christine? I'm finding her slightly muted, so if we could turn Christine up a little bit. Sorry, Christine. What is the atmosphere? You're in the chamber, you're moving around in the European Parliament. What is the talk, and what is the mood of your colleagues, those with whom you agree and those with whom you don't?
Well, truth be told, the ones that I don't agree with and the ones that don't agree with me, they don't really speak to me. I mean, there is MEPs that will step off the elevator just because I step on. It's insane. So there isn't really a lot of conversations going on. It's strictly business, for example, in the committee meetings. And even there, they'd rather I not say anything. But here I am, and you know, I just can't keep my mouth shut, so deal with it. But yeah, they are kind of, they're frightened at this point, because a lot of them do realize what they're doing is not right. They're not serving in the best interest of the people, and it is no longer government of the people, by the people, for the people. At this point, it's government of the globalitarian misanthropists, for the globalitarian misanthropists, and by the globalitarian misanthropists. That's what we're looking at. And they're beginning to realize that the people will no longer let them get away with it, and they can no longer fool them. into thinking about we have to save the planet now, and it's climate change, and it's all of this. People no longer believe in that, and I think they're catching on to the fact that it's a gigantic lie.
Christine, I've been listening to you for years now, and you come across as a person with righteous anger. Do you feel any sort of vulnerability? Has it made your life difficult because you have taken such a forthright stance in the face of all of this?
Well, I mean, obviously, yeah. So I live under an undisclosed address that's not publicly available because my house has been vandalized. I mean, I had a thrown stone at my head. That was in 2015, and personal attacks. So I had a mob showing up at my house at like 2 a.m. in the morning, and just screaming around while my kids were sleeping in the house, by the way. So yeah, obviously we are living in times where you actually would have to go back a very long time to find parallels. And I kind of thought that we had overcome that. And, most people, they pretty much claim to have learned from history. Turns out they haven't learned a damn thing. And we've been seeing that in the last 4 years with this so-called pandemic. There was, fear all over. People were being coerced, they were manipulated, gaslighted. I mean, it was terrible. There was ostracization going on. People were threatened with their livelihoods. You won't have a job if you don't take the jab. And all of this going on. And that does remind me of very dark times that, especially here in Germany, we had to live through. And I would have hoped we would never see anything like that ever again. But here we are.
Ingrid Tarrant, listening to Christine Anderson there, do you think that the climb down is sincere, or do you think it's just what you would expect from worried politicians approaching elections?
Yeah, I think what Christine says, and actually she would know better than ever, I think it is a little bit sort of like climb down to appease. At the moment, it's timely to do that, but I think it's very insincere. They just want to keep pushing this agenda. And not backing out. But it's quite interesting, though, I have to say, that I wonder if people are beginning, really, though, when I say people that's on high, that we're not taking this net zero agenda anymore. Starmer backed down from the U-turn with 38 billion investment in net zero as well. And I just wonder a little bit if it's just shifting and they perhaps are trying to compromise a bit, or just beginning to realise that we've seen right through them as an absolute nonsense. It'd be interesting to see how it plays out, especially post-elections.
Christine, listening to Ingrid Tarrant there, do you sense the same, that whether or not this is a kicking into the long grass to let them get through the elections, is it finally getting to them that if a population as traditionally conservative as farmers, aided and abetted by swathes of population, are kicking off about net zero and Agenda 2030, do you think finally the message is getting through to them?
Well, if you're talking about is the message getting through to the politicians who are responsible for all of that? No, it's not. I mean, EU Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen backing down on this one, or at least, partially taking it back. That is just a tactical retreat to, appease the people and, get them through election. And once the elections are done with, trust me, they will just pretend, well, we never said that. No, we're not going to do that. So, and they will once again go full force on that. But now they have to look at getting through June 9th. That's the last day of the elections. And starting up again in July and in August, you will see they will not remember ever having said that they were going to partially walk it back.
What will it take then, if their population's rising, if the farmers upon whom we all depend 3 times a day for our daily bread and the rest, what will it take? Because we need to get away from net zero.
We do. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, there is climate change. Of course there is, because I'm being called a climate change denier, right? there is climate change, but there has always been climate change. But it's absolute hubris to think that we as men have such an impact on climate that we could actually change it. And to make matters worse, I'm German, right? So we're shutting down all of our nuclear power plants and doing all of that. And it's literally Germany is now saving the whole planet, right? Oh gosh, this is insane. So, anyways, we have to get away. We have to get away from that. But they're not sincere. And when you ask what will it take, you would think. Ursula von der Leyen, I heard your quote. Apparently, she said our farmers are worth or deserve to be listened to. It's not just the farmers. That is democracy. The elected officials and elected representatives, they listen to the people point blank. And if they're not doing that, then they have no place in being in office. So, but they're not. They want the people to do as they are told. And that's what we're talking about. So I don't know what it will take, but from all the uprising throughout the countries we're seeing, we are actually in a cold civil war already.
A cold civil war. Christine Anderson, once again, thank you so much for giving so generously of your time this evening. I'll hope we get the chance to speak again. Thank you for now.
Thanks for having me.
After the break, we'll continue this discussion with the editor of The Daily Sceptic, Will Jones. Don't go anywhere. I am still Neil Oliver, and this is still GB News.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
Are you across this microaggression story?
I'm across microaggressions. I'm also across XL bullies.
You would not last 5 minutes.
Oh, for God's
So
sake, civil servants, give me strength.
So civil servants have been taught not to roll their eyes. Something you do very well. We both do it quite a lot, actually.
Because it's seen as an act of microaggression. This, by the way, this costs the taxpayer, this training, £160,000. What the hell is going on in our woke civil service? Who cares if someone rolls their eyes in exasperation?
What the hell is going on in our civil service, full stop, if the way that civil servants are communicating with each other is rolling their eyes and looking at their phones? I mean, is the government being run by people who are essentially acting to each other like stroppy teenagers?
But I'm all right with people, because, you see, I would be in defence of eye rolling.
So me too, I couldn't care less.
But do you know why? Because I want people to give me their genuine reaction, as long as it's not deeply offensive. But I want to know how people feel. And what they're being told here, civil servants are being taught, and of course this is an area of employment law, because people are taking cases against their bosses who roll their eyes at them. They're saying they're being encouraged to say nothing and nod their heads to promote transparency and inclusion. Don't show what you really think, just nod your head.
But I think that comes with then saying what you really think, and this is the key problem, and what these courses are trying to establish. And I looked into some of them when I was researching this, and it's not saying hide what you're feeling. It's saying, rather than huffing and puffing and rolling your eyes, if you've got a disagreement with someone, say I've got a disagreement with someone. Because otherwise, you can't have an effective workplace if people are sort of just passively, aggressively huffing at each
Why
other.
do these civil servants need to be taught this? Why do people need to be taught this? This is just normal discourse in a normal working day. You don't need a seminar on it.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Richard Tice, as I cover Michael Portillo's show on Sunday morning on GB News at 11 o'clock. I'm going to be looking again at the child maintenance service. My real concerns about incorrect calculations, about persecuting parents when the numbers are wrong, or unbelievably, they've already paid. We've got to get to the bottom of this. I'll be talking to some parents and an expert on this. Join me, Richard Tice, Sunday morning, 11 o'clock. Don't miss it.
Welcome back. Continuing the subject of the farmers' protest, let's say, I'm joined by the editor of the Daily Sceptic, who feels this might be the end of the net zero demands. Joining me now, Will, are you there?
I am. Hi, Neil.
Delighted to have you with me this evening. What do you hear from your contacts in relation to this within the European Union, within that Parliament? You know, are they running scared, or is it just insincere preparations for elections?
Well, you've got to suspect a lot of cynicism here, haven't you? There's clear anticipation of the elections coming up. We're hearing about that from Christine Anderson. They've got an eye on those elections. There's a huge swell of support for Eurosceptic parties, and we have the farmers who traditionally have been very, very pro-EU. Of course, they stuff their mouths with gold with the subsidies, with the agricultural policy. So traditionally, they rely and expect the farmers to play ball, to stay on side, and yet here they are across the EU, across Europe, just coming out, rising up in protest against these extraordinary measures, net zero measures that the EU is bringing in to really slash the farming and their business and their livelihood, and they're really not happy. It's a real sea change and tidal change, and of course there's cynicism. Of course they've got these elections in mind, but I think we have to say that of course the farmers aren't going anywhere. If they do just bring it all back, if they do just bring all these measures back after the elections, then the farmers will just come out again. These protests, they've been across Europe. They've occurred in Austria, in Italy, Belgium, France, Germany, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Spain. I mean, really, it's across the whole continent. And those farmers aren't going anywhere. And if they try and do it again, then those farmers are just going to come out again. So I think we do have to see it as a sea change, as net zero meeting the cold, hard reality of people's livelihoods and prosperity. And I do think we have to see that as we get closer and closer to these targets, these deadlines, 2040 for 90% cuts in emissions, 2050 for net zero itself, we are going to see these targets falling and melting away, because net zero is coming apart at the seams, let's be honest.
Well, what is the way back from net zero? You know, we've done away with domestic sources of energy. You know, Germany, what with the loss of the Nord Stream pipeline, whoever blew that up, I think we all have our suspicions there. You know, what is realistically the way to unpick all of this? Because that tapestry of net zero seems to be pretty thoroughly woven now.
Yeah, they've really been pushing that agenda, haven't they? It's really got us captured. But I think as these targets fall, and as we've already seen in the UK, we've seen those ill-conceived targets of the boiler tax, that's already gone. The ban on internal combustion engines, petrol and diesel cars. We've seen that ban being pushed back by 5 years. So we've seen those targets, and this is just the start. We've seen Keir Starmer and the Labour Party drop their £28 billion a year green spending pledge as unaffordable. So that gives us an indication of how this will happen, just bit by bit. The targets will be dropped because reality will hit home in one way or another, and people will not put up with mass, frankly, deindustrialisation and impoverishment. And that's what the farmers were staring at, of course.
The other part of your article in the Daily Sceptic, you looked into your crystal ball a bit about the populist parties, so-called, and some predictions. What do you think is going to be the texture of the European Union when we get to the other side of these elections in June? Is there going to be a surge by the so-called extremist far-right populist parties?
Oh, well, yeah, the tarring of and smearing of these parties, anything that goes against the EU orthodoxy on anything from net zero to immigration obviously gets tarred with the so-called far-right and extremist brush. But certainly there's a huge surge across the continent of support for Eurosceptic parties which are not happy with the levels of immigration coming into Europe, illegal and legal immigration, and parties which are not happy with net zero measures, the extreme measures that do threaten to deindustrialise and impoverish the continent. And all to nothing, of course, because as we know, the net zero in Europe is really achieved by outsourcing all our industry to other countries, to China, to India, who are pushing full steam ahead with coal power plants and with all kinds of all the measures and steel making, all the things that we are pushing away from our own shores because we say that they make too many emissions. We're just pushing those to them.
Bear with me, Will. Ingrid Tarrant, do you feel any optimism? Do you feel any sense that we are in a position to begin pushing back against net zero in a meaningful way?
I do. I really do. I think that the people that I speak to, and more, are very much in this net zero. It's a con. It's all about the tax. They're not having it. And then it's the bigger picture as well, that sort of we're going to be eating bugs. We won't be able to have any grazing animals. We won't even be able to have pets, you know, stuff like that.
And then ludicrous.
I know, it is absolutely... And then the Just Stop Oil, that comes into it, because that plays... Because they're all very interwoven. It's like the tapestry is saying, it's very, very closely knit. And I just think it is falling apart from just speaking to people. So I do feel optimistic.
Thanks, Ingrid. And thank you, Will Jones, editor of The Daily Sceptic. So good to catch up with you, and we can do this again. Thank you for now.
Thank you.
Making way there for another break, after which I'll be chatting to Stephanie Grisham to hear her opinions on that interview. This is Neil Oliver on GB News. Great stuff.
Do you feel optimistic?
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show, Sunday mornings from 9:30.
Questions to be answered, and there seem to be a significant amount, does once again point its way to a public inquiry into exactly what happened in this case. Starmer's called for that. Would you call for that too?
I certainly think that first of all, there's one thing that's happening now. The NHS have to order an independent inquiry. That's been done. So they've got to look at all the whys and wherefores of what happened with this man. If it appears that we're not getting sufficient depth and breadth to this, then I think having an inquiry with all the powers that brings would be extremely advantageous. What I don't want is some long-winded inquiry that will take years, by which time other people will have been put at risk and maybe other lives have lost. We know what the problems are here, Camilla. Law's been passed on this. This is all about making sure on the ground we implement the highest degree of monitoring in order to ensure the safety of the public.
Has care in the community failed? I mean, it seems oxymoronic to say that it's care in the community in this case. We know that the number of psychiatric care beds has been slashed from 52,000 back in 2001 to 24,000 now. I've anecdotally, because I wrote my column about this in The Telegraph yesterday, received quite a lot of correspondence from people saying the situation with care in the community is dire. People aren't being adequately monitored. Was it a mistake to close down all of those mental institutions?
I don't think we should go back to those days when we had those appalling institutions where we just lock people away and forget about them, and not just mental health people, but autistic people and disabled people. Horrific way to treat individuals, and you know I campaign on that a lot.
I know.
However, I think if we move into a more community-based approach, which can be really good for many, many people who are on the spectrum and on that scale of mental health, we have to remember there will be a small but significant number who will continue to pose a danger.
Okay.
And that's why monitoring is so important.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm joined now by Stephanie Grisham, who is a former White House press secretary, to talk about what we actually learned from this groundbreaking interview. Good evening, Stephanie.
Hi, Neil. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Now, you come from this background of dealing with journalists, dealing with media. Is this where we are now? What shocked me as much as anything else was the way in which Tucker Carlson was vilified before the fact, just for having sought an interview with a world leader.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment. I think that I know that there is any outlet here in the United States would love to interview Vladimir Putin. I do think that, during the interview itself, I think that Putin went largely unchallenged, which was a disappointment. However, I think that one redeeming quality from that interview was the fact that, Tucker asked about freeing Evan Gershkovich, which is a Wall Street Journal reporter that's being held in Russia for espionage falsely. So, I think any media outlet would interview Putin. I think that the line of questioning probably would have been different. And I would say, I think it's pretty obvious that Putin was using Tucker to speak to a part of our legislature that's grappling with funding Ukraine further in the war between Russia and Ukraine.
In that light, what questions would you have wanted to ask if you had been in that position of being the interviewer?
It's funny that you asked me that. I thought that as I was kind of getting ready for this interview. I thought, what would I ask? And I think for me, I am not a reporter and I'm certainly not a national security expert, but I would ask the first question I would ask is about Evan, about the Wall Street Journal reporter. And, why are you keeping him? And it's been almost a year and how can we get him back? I'd also ask about, Alexei Navalny, who's been held, he's obviously an anti-corruption activist and an opposition leader that's gone against Putin, and he's being held. And actually for a while, nobody could find him. So I would ask, why is it that your enemies are constantly, falling out of windows or being poisoned? I think I'd go on that line of questioning. But again, I'm no reporter.
When you watched, as I'm sure you did, Hillary Clinton in advance of the interview, saying that pouring scorn on leaders who would imprison opponents. How did that strike you, given the past months or longer of Democrats seeking to imprison, or at the very least throw the book at their main opposition, Donald Trump? Was that not rank hypocrisy of the first order?
Well, look, right now, as I'm sure you know, our politics are just visceral, and it is a split screen. The hypocrisy on both sides is pretty bad, and it's unfortunate for our country. We've got Biden, who, has his own issues. We've got Trump, who has many, many issues. And I think just depending on what political side you're on, everybody's sticking with their guy rather than being, pragmatic and looking at it from both sides. So absolutely, there's a lot of hypocrisy right here because people are just so angry.
And when it comes to the vilification of Tucker Carlson for even doing what he did, for going to Russia to speak to a head of state, isn't that what your old boss, Donald Trump, would have advocated anyway? Didn't he have a reputation for seeking to talk and to strike deals, rather than to open up with bullets and bombs?
I think that that's a really interesting way to frame it. I think the problem with my former boss, with Trump, and then also with Tucker, was that, yes, while they just want to speak to a leader like Putin, they also almost romanticized them, constantly with Trump. He was constantly talking about his love letters between Kim Jong-un and himself. And I think that a lot of times when it came time, he didn't hold their feet to the fire. I recall one press conference between Trump and Putin when Trump was asked, do you believe in our national security people, our intelligence people, or do you believe Putin? And Trump said, I believe Putin. And I think that missteps like that have not been good for the country. I think that's where from.
Bear with me, Stephanie. Ingrid, what did you make of that interview, you know, when you watched, you know, you say you don't read body language, but your impression, did you think that Tucker gave him an easy ride?
Perhaps he could have asked a few more pertinent questions, but he gave him the platform to speak. So, and that is a lot of the art of interviewing. You ask a few key questions and let the person continue to talk. And he did talk for 2 hours. I think it was very insightful. He did pull him up on a few things. I can't remember exactly what, but it was a soft approach, but it showed. What came out of that very strongly for me, irrespective of the detail, that Putin is passionate. He's a really patriotic. He wants the best of his country, and he looks at the West and he laughs at our wokeness and things like that.
What about that, Stephanie, that idea that Ingrid suggests there, that, you know, you can't deny that we were looking at a world leader who was professing love of country. It was persuasive in that way, at least, no?
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think that any leader of a country is going to speak that way about their country. I think that in the beginning, the history that he talked about between Russia and Ukraine was a little skewed towards his belief, and he was trying to, again, I think, reach an audience here in the United States with the object of just not getting us, the Congress here, to fund the fund the Ukrainians in the war. So I think that he had a clear agenda. You know, he's former KGB. He's a smart man. He knows what he's doing. And so his agenda, I think, was to talk to Congress and say, hey, stop funding Ukraine. He had talking points down. He said, you have immigration issues in the United States. You have the national debt in the United States. He was quite good, I think, at talking to that audience.
Stephanie, who in America, or indeed anywhere else, could speak for 30 minutes about the 1,000 years of their country's history? Well, in the case of America, 200 and so years of history. Was that in itself, you know, when did we last hear a world leader seek to do that?
Well, I mean, Tucker definitely gave him the time to do that. That's for sure.
And what was your overall assessment of the man? You know, we've been invited to consider Vladimir Putin as to be a madman. We've had all sorts of reports about his physical fitness, you know, and suggestions that he's on the road out. You looked at him there in the room with Tucker Carlson. What did you think?
I mean, it was the Vladimir Putin I was used to seeing when we would do bilateral meetings between Trump and Putin. He's a very confident man. He goes in knowing what he's going to say. He clearly had his agenda written out. He wanted to make sure that, you know, Congress doesn't fund Ukraine. And so in that regard, I think he did what he set out to do.
Running out of time there, Stephanie. Thank you so much for giving of your time this evening. Great to see you. We'll catch up again. Thanks to all my guests, my wonderful panellist, Ingrid Tarrant, from whom I would have heard so much more. Next up, it's the Saturday 5. I'll see you next week. Thanks.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, good evening. I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. Have quite a foggy and murky night to come ahead of us leading into Sunday. Certainly could see some mist and fog patches forming relatively widely across areas of the UK. Quite a damp night as well, with showers pushing across the southwest. This band of longer rain moving into eastern England and eastern Scotland as well. Could be some localised disruption with this rainfall falling on already very saturated ground. Temperatures though underneath all that cloud generally holding up above freezing, but we can't rule out a patchy frost for some clearer spells across areas of Scotland. But it will be quite a damp start to Sunday again, with those showers pushing their way through. Could be quite heavy, maybe with some thunder along some coastal areas of the far south. Rain eventually clearing for eastern England, but it is going to be a very wet day for northeastern areas of Scotland. But some brighter spells developing as we head into the afternoon too, though, with some continuing showers moving in from the west. Temperatures generally around 7 to 11 degrees Celsius. On Monday, the area of low pressure that we have seen around this weekend will slowly drift its way northwards, a bit closer towards Iceland. That allows this northwesterly flow of air to start moving its way in. Quite a lot of isobars on the chart there, so it will be a relatively breezy day for most of us. Those showers will be most frequent in the north and west, particularly further parts of Northern Ireland, western Scotland, but areas further towards the east, starting off with a decent amount of sunshine, a bit of fair weather cloud bubbling up into the afternoon. Can't rule out the odd shower, but certainly drier here nonetheless. We hold on to a fairly changeable theme throughout next week, so further showers and longer spells of rain certainly on the cards for many. Bye-bye.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning.